you want to catch a tarpon. Well, as you can see, today is definitely not the day to go about it. So what I think I'll do is a series of videos titled Beginner's Guide to Catching a Florida Keys Tarpon, which I can start off with by doing it from the safety of my home, and give you the basics of what you need and where to go and how to do it and get yourself your own Florida Keys Tarpon. So check it out. All right, let's get you your tarpon. But before we get started, I will give you the upfront, most effective, efficient way of getting your first tarpon. Hire a local guide. All right, these men and women are going to be fishing the tarpon every day from sun up to sundown. They're going to know like clockwork where the fish are, when they're feeding, what bait to use. All right, so it's going to be very, very easy for them to put you on a tarpon. That's great for you. You get your itch scratched, and if you keep your mind open, you're going to learn a plain and easy, simple technique that you can utilize if you have your own boat or kayak or fishing from shore and whatnot. All right, so very effective way. Yes, it's expensive. You're looking at $400 or $500 to $1,000 for a half to full day, but it's just a matter trade-off of how much time versus money. So it's all up to you. I will asterisk though, I did say local guide. You do want to kind of take that in consideration. You have guides that are here year-round, all right, that will, I guarantee you, will be very vested in the tarpon fishery. They're going to want to make sure things are taken care of, they're not shortcuts, that the tarpon are being handled correctly and so forth, because that's how they make their money year after year, and they're going to be very vested in protecting it. Versus, not saying they're bad, but then you have other guides that are coming down just for the tarpon season. All right, they maybe guide somewhere else. Maybe they just come because they know that they can make some quick, easy money in a short window with very little effort, and they'll come down, make their money, and then take off. And on top of that, you have some scammers that have no licenses, they're not insured, they don't really have the backgrounds, and unless that things line up perfectly, the small section that they know, and things change, they're not going to be able to adapt and still be able to get you on a tarpon, versus a full-time guide that's here year-round that knows when all of a sudden a storm pops in and it's blowing 20 to 30 knots out there from the east, they still know where they can go, where you're going to get sheltered and catch a fish. So kind of take care of the local guides. They're truly vested into it because they're also the most knowledgeable. All right, so just a little helpful hint there. So now let's get you on a tarpon. All right, let's get started. First off, I'm going to be doing a whole string of these videos to try to kind of break it up. However, I'm going to probably do quite a few of them in a very short amount of time because we're right at the beginning of the actual full-on tarpon migration, which is kind of the peak period. So I've had a lot more inquiries starting to come in more and more. Take me fishing, show me how, what about, how do you do this type of stuff. So I'll try to get these kicked out quite a bit. So let's get started. So my technique is still based on my overall strategy for fishing in general. 3 main topics. 1, go to where the fish are. 2, fish when they feed. 3, use what they eat. All right, those 3 key things are basically what I'm gonna, well, that's my strategy for fishing and catching anything, but for these tarpon videos, that's kind of the key subject matters that we're going to start with. So for today, we're going to look at go to where the fish are. All right, for number 1, go to where the fish are. I'm actually going to break this up into 2 separate videos. Today's video is going to be about the tarpon migration. The second video will be about actually going out, and I'll show you certain areas that are kind of the main meetup points for the tarpon, where you're going to find more of the chance of finding bulk amounts of tarpon, which means a better chance at catching one. So let's talk about the tarpon migration. Now there are basically 2 groups of tarpon schools. One is in the Gulf of Mexico, and one runs along the Atlantic coastline. The one in the Gulf of Mexico, if you look at Google Earth, I'll put one up here, and you take a look at the Gulf of Mexico, you'll see it's actually very close to being a pond, okay? If Cuba was a little bit longer and touched basically the dry Tortugas and went all the way to Mexico and the Yucatan, which is really not very far, okay, it would be blocked off and Gulf of Mexico would be basically an enclosed pond. But what happens though is that you have a school of tarpon that basically just rings that school, goes around it, back and forth, okay? And that's their life. They're the Gulf of Mexico tarpon. Then you have the second school, which is the Atlantic East Coast, and they run from the Keys and the Caribbean up to as far north as Chesapeake Bay. And they just, throughout their life cycle, they just kind of go from as far north as Chesapeake Bay and run down to the Keys and the Caribbean. And when that's over with, and they go back up, all right? Now, there are tarpon that stay in one spot year-round. They have some that travel that whole thing a couple times a year. But in general, we're talking about the main group when we talk the tarpon run, the tarpon migration. I'm talking about in general, the big school, okay? Scheduling, all right, when they're here. Very key part, go to where the fish are because they're not here all year round. The Gulf of Mexico tarpon migrate through the Keys roughly as early as they can be February, more likely March, April, okay? And the one component that majority of scientists can say kind of kicks off these migrations is the atmospheric changes, the temperature, water changes in particular. I think it's 75 to 79 degrees roughly is that kind of king factor which triggers something in the tarpon to know it's time to move. Now, if you're really into it and you want to get the scientific side of what all I'm talking about, if you go to the Tarpon and Bonefish Trust, okay, just do a search for that. They're a very high-end, very respected group that's all they do is they do the backside research about the life cycle of bonefish, tarpon, and the whole Keys fishery, to be honest with you. Very knowledgeable, a lot of great information. For me, I know I don't need all that stuff. I just kind of know where and when the fish are going to be here. All right. So we got the Gulf side. We know that they're going to be, depending on the weather, the temperatures, it can be as early as February, most likely about April. They're coming down and they start meeting up in the Keys. Okay. The Atlantic side comes a little bit later. They start showing up in bulk numbers around that May-ish, May, June, depending again how the weather is and global warming and so forth. They kind of meet up here for two reasons. One is to breed and the other is to feed. Kind of like pretty much every other animal. All right. So they'll come down to the Keys and in the certain areas down here, they'll head offshore and they'll go 100, 150, 200 miles offshore, find wherever they want to go. And then they dive way down into the depths, 4,000, 5,000 feet, whatever it is, where that gives them the best opportunity to lay eggs and fertilize those eggs and get the start of the breeding cycle. Once they're done with that, they make that exhausting swim all the way finally back to the Keys, and that's when they're just feeding and ferocious. And that's that May, June, sometimes July time when people say you want to be in the Keys in that May, June, July, that migration time. That's because all those fish have done their offshore stuff and now they're coming back in and they're just gobbling stuff off. They're not stuck in one little spot. They're everywhere. They're in those channels, out the bridges. They're on the flats because they're going one place to another. But they're not just like, ooh, I got to get to this spot to breed. No, they're like, ooh, there's some food there. I'm hungry. Stop off, eat here for a while. Go move, find a spot that has more food, stop there and eat. So they're jumping all over the place and that spreads things out. Plus they're feeding, all right? So that gives us fishermen the best opportunity to go and catch one. So for you guys, okay, to keep that high average, May, June, somewhat July, by the time you start hitting into August, September, those numbers, they're starting to push, going back to wherever they're going to go, start moving up the Atlantic coast, start going off towards the Texas side and around the Gulf of Mexico. And then by the time the cold temps come, we still have tarpon here year round, but then they tend to be those fun juveniles that I'm catching with the live lining pilchards. All right, so that's a key component. All right, you want the best chance at coming to get a tarpon June, middle May through June. That's the time frame. You want a guaranteed time to come for if you're a fly person, fly fishing, Palolo worm hatch. Research that. There's a couple 3-week time frame where, man, that's when I catch all my tarpon on the fly there. All right. So that kind of will give you a breakdown on the tarpon migration. Like I said, if you want the fine details and you're very interested in it, just do some basic research. Check out the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. Take a reading there, get a lot more detail than I'm giving. But otherwise, that'll help you out. And if you're here February, March, you got a shot at a Gulf tarpon. You always have those early birds and you always have those late ones. So they're around. It's just best chance, May, June, July. All right. Thanks for watching. Keep an eye out for my next video where we kind of go out and I'll show you a few places to look.